Right now, the Atlanta Falcons are only giving up 244 yards a game. That's incredible. That's better than the Cleveland Browns. Welcome to Just the Stats NFL, the show that covers the all-time greats in statistics as well as the current players leading the NFL. In this episode, we're going to cover the top 10s among teams in different categories. So we'll cover everything from individual game stats, cover that quickly through the first 5 weeks, what teams have had the best games, individual games in various categories. And then we'll look at the teams overall for the whole season. So I'm Ernie Jennings, your host, and I know this is coming a little bit late, but I thought I'd get it out there anyway. So we're going to run through this and see how it goes. All right, so let's start with the top 10 teams in individual games in various categories. And we'll start with rushing yards. For example, the Las Vegas Raiders in week 4 had the most rushing yards in a single game. They had 240 yards in their game. Now, they only had 117 yards passing. They rushed the ball 31 times, passed it 21, but they did have 240 yards, average 7.7 yards a carry, and yet they ended up losing to the Bears. The Raiders have lost some games incredibly strangely, as have a couple of other teams like the Cardinals, for example. Carolina Panthers, another team you would not expect to see up here necessarily. Just this past week, they had 239 yards, and that's would Rico Dowdle came in and had 200 yards by himself, 206 or I think it was. So 239 yards, second best, and that was in week 5. Now the Ravens in the first game that they played, 238 yards, and that was a game where Derrick Henry had 169 yards himself. And obviously Lamar Jackson had a lot of rushing yards too. Buffalo Bills in week 2 had 224 yards, as did the Detroit Lions in week 3. Those two had 224. There's been 9 teams that had 200 or more yards rushing in a single game. The Washington Commanders, the only ones on the list that did it twice. Pretty impressive, and a lot of that's coming from Daniel as well. So 9 teams with 200 or more yards rushing in a single game. Now, what's also interesting is out of those top 9, actually 7 of them won their games. 2 did not. One was the Raiders, who had the most rushing yards, lost that game by a point, as did the Baltimore Ravens, who lost their game by a point. So even though they rushed for 238 yards, only a couple yards difference. So usually when you see somebody rushing that much, it's because they're dominating the game and end up winning it, but not in this case. All right, let's look at passing yards in a single game. New York Giants. This is incredible that it's New York Giants, but this was before Wilson got sacked. He threw for, I was going to say 450, but it must subtract off, I forgot how many yards actually, but 422 total if it takes off the yardage for sacks. But that was also in a loss to the Dallas Cowboys, 40-37. Buffalo Bills had 389 yards in a win. That was the first game of the year with the Ravens when it looked like, obviously the Ravens were going to be a good team. They fought Buffalo all the way to the wire, and yet the Ravens have only won 1 game so far this season. Los Angeles Rams just this last week, as did Tampa Bay Buccaneers last week. 78 for Rams, 370 for Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Just about every team won times already, unlike the rushing, where there's been only 9 times somebody's rushed for 200 or more yards. 21 times already teams have passed for over 300 yards. Obviously, some of those have been the same teams over and over. A couple of teams have been on this list more than once. I'm looking through the list here to see who has been on this a couple of times. Dallas Cowboys bit a couple of times. Now, the Kansas City Chiefs just on Monday night, 318 yards in a loss, 31-28. So looking at the top 10 teams, three out of 10 did lose in this top 10. So still a pretty good stat when you can throw for that many yards. Now, total yards, looking at total yards, three teams have combined yardage for over 500 yards in a single game. Denver Broncos did it against the Cincinnati Bengals when they won 28-3. That was a blowout. And they had 512 yards in that game. Detroit Lions, when they blew out the Chicago Bears 52-21, 511 yards. And then that was in week 2. And then also in week 2, the New York Giants, when they lost to Dallas Cowboys, had 506 yards, and they ended up losing that game. Now, what's interesting in this as well is those top 3 games, the Detroit Lions had 511 yards on 58 plays. That's incredible. So just in comparison, the Denver Broncos had 512, so one more yard, but they had 80 plays to get to basically the same amount of yards. Yards per play, that Detroit Lions game against Chicago, they had 8.8 yards per play, which is the highest so far this year. 3 teams have actually had over 8. Baltimore Ravens and Seattle Seahawks, who just last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, in a loss as well, averaged 8.6 yards a play. 2 teams, Ravens and the Seahawks, you're averaging 8.6 yards per play, and you lose. Both of them are very close, 38-35. Seahawks lost to the Buccaneers, and the Ravens lost to the Bills 41-40. But still, you're averaging 8.6 yards a play, and you don't win. That's amazing. And in fact, the top 5, despite having the highest yards per play averages here, 4 of them lost. I find that really fascinating that you can have 7, like Kansas City Chiefs, just this last week against the Jaguars, had 7.6 yards per play, and they lost the game. Now, sometimes turnovers could have a factor in that, but they only had 1 in that particular game, even though it was gigantic. But key turnovers and key penalties can just stymie an offense sometimes. So when we're looking at the top 10, 6 of the top 10 lost their game despite having at least 7.1 yards per play. It's pretty interesting. Now looking at total touchdowns, the most touchdowns so far in a game was that same Detroit Lions game when they romped Chicago 52-21. They had 7 TDs. Indianapolis Colts also in a romp against the Raiders last week, had 40-6. They won. They had 6 touchdowns. And then there's quite a few teams that had 5, but 7 and 6 is a lot of touchdowns. All right, so that's a look at some of the individual game leaders so far. Detroit Lions are up here. They're impressive. In fact, they've got 2 of the top touchdown totals this season. So they're going to be somebody to definitely teams are going to have to deal with. And they're also got 2 of the top 17 total yard games. The Rams are up. Wow. The Rams have 3 of the top 12 as far as most yards in a single game. But in those 3, they won 2, lost 1. So we'll see. All right, let's look at the total offensive numbers here. Actually, what we'll do is start with rushing yards per game. Look at the top 10 teams. Well, right now there's 2 teams way out in the lead. And you would think it would be the Ravens because of Jackson and Henry, but they're not. Like last year, they were so impressive with the rush that right now they're right in the middle of the pack. But the top 2 are the Washington Commanders, averaging 156.4 yards a game. And then the Buffalo Bills averaging 154.4. So just 2 yards a game difference for those top 2. The only ones over 145 yards, actually. The Jets are next with 144.4. So those two, Buffalo and Washington, really have quite a running game. And, interesting, the Commanders have kind of found a running back in Bill, while the Buffalo Bills have obviously Cook as their running back, but both teams also have running quarterbacks in Daniels for the Commanders and Allen for Bills. So it kind of partly explains why they have such good rushing numbers. All right. So those are the top two. There's another couple of teams rushing for over 140 yards. That's the Jets and the Broncos. And then it really drops down to the 137 for the Jacksonville Jaguars, who were up here early, but have kind of slowed their pace as far as yards per game go. All right, let's look at the passing yards per game. I'm doing it more by game because of the fact we're going to start getting the bye weeks and teams won't have the same amount of games played. Right now, again, two teams well ahead of the other teams. San Francisco 49ers, believe it or not, who have wide receivers that have been injured all season. Kittle's been out most of the time. I mean, it's incredible that they're leading the NFL in yards per game passing with 290.6. So pretty close to 300. And then the Rams, who obviously have Puka Nacua, for example, and Devontae Adams, obviously they're going to have you would think they'd have a high yards per game. They have 289.6. So 1 yard difference between the top two. Then there's a big drop off to the Dallas Cowboys, who have 272.2. So that's 17 and 18 yards drop from the top two teams. Then there's even another 19-point drop from third to fourth, and that is the Indianapolis Colts are averaging 253 yards per game. Seattle Seahawks 245, and it's at that point, after another 8-yard drop per game between the Colts and Seahawks, that the numbers start to bunch up a little bit more. But quite a difference between the top two teams, then the next third place team, and then you start seeing a little bit more of a bunching at fourth on down. Those are some of your top teams as yards per game go passing. All right, let's look at total yards. Two teams right now are averaging over 400 yards a game, and that is the Dallas Cowboys with 406.6 yards a game and the Los Angeles Rams with 401.8 yards a game. Now, the Cowboys, I pretty much figured they'd be passing the ball a lot. What I didn't see was that Javonte Williams would be such an impactful running back, which has really given them a much more balanced offense in some sense. Buffalo Bills are third with 395.8. And then there's again a big drop off, 14 yards down to Indianapolis Colts, who are fourth right now. So when you look at this, the Dallas Cowboys, one of the best offenses, but they have just a very bad defense. So that's what's hindering them in their record this year so far. The Rams have a good record. Obviously, the Buffalo Bills do, the Indianapolis Colts, San Francisco 49ers, Detroit Lions. These are the next teams, all 4-1. Then you have the Atlanta Falcons, kind of an enigma, and the Kansas City Chiefs, who are 2-3. Seahawks 3-2. So those are some of the teams at the top there in total yards. Now looking at points per game, Detroit Lions lead this. There's 4 teams averaging 30 or more points a game. Detroit Lions 34.8 yards a game. The Colts 32.6. The Buffalo Bills 30.6 and the Dallas Cowboys 30.2. Now interestingly, the Baltimore Ravens 28.2. Going into last week's game when they just got shellacked, I think they scored 6 points. They were averaging 33 or so points a game. That took their number way down, and it's going to continue to go down. If Jackson doesn't play, it's going to go down again for sure. But the Detroit Lions have a high-powered offense, one of the top teams all around. Indianapolis Colts have looked very impressive. They're averaging 32.6 points a game. There have been I think they're third or fourth in offense. I just said that in total yards a game. They're fourth in total yards a game. So they've got Daniel Jones has been impressive. This is the opposite of the Cowboys, where I thought the Cowboys obviously would pass a lot and not have much of a running game. I really thought the Colts would have a decent running game, but not so much a passing game. Well, Daniel Jones has been impressive, and which has given them such a balanced offense. All right, so looking at the points per game again, like I said, 4 teams, 30 or more points. Seahawks 29.2, and then it kind of steadily drops down after that, all the way down to, sadly, the Cleveland Browns and Tennessee Titans tied at the bottom with 14.6 points a game. All right, one more category in this team we'll look at for offense purposes. That's giveaways. We'll look at them both so we can kind of see a total. But this year on offense, the team that has had the fewest giveaways, there's 3 of them. Green Bay Packers, Kansas City Chiefs, and Tampa Bay Buccaneers have only given the ball away twice. Kansas City, it's been 2 interceptions, no fumbles. And then the other ones have been 1 and 1. Now, the Kansas City interception, the second one of Mahomes' for this season, was that 99-yard interception return for a touchdown. That was a huge interception. But only 3 teams with 2 or fewer interceptions so far this season. Now, when we look at total turnovers from the other end, right now the Cincinnati Bengals have 11 turnovers so far. Las Vegas Raiders have 10. The Minnesota Vikings 9, and then you start dropping down quite a few teams with 8. But 2 teams with 10 or more. Now, looking at turnovers, this is one of the things with Baltimore. I want to look at the Buffalo Bills. 4 turnovers so far this year. 2 interceptions, 2 fumbles. And I always mention them because last year they had a historic level of lack of turnovers, so few turnovers last year. And so they have 4 now in 5 games. It's going to be interesting. You just can't, it's kind of just happens that if you have so few turnovers in one season, not that you're going to go crazy the other way, but you're just not going to get that few again the next year. But they had a historically low number of turnovers last year. So we'll see what happens, but so far already 4. All right. Now, looking at defense, we'll look at total yards right now. Right now, the Atlanta Falcons are only giving up 244 yards a game. That's incredible. That's better than the Cleveland Browns. Now, the Cleveland Browns have played some pretty good teams, and still they're only giving up 247.8 yards per game. Those are the 2 lowest by quite a bit. There's a 18-yard gap between Cleveland Browns and the Houston Texans, who are third with 265.8 yards a game. Top 3, then there's a big jump again, another 18 points to the Green Bay Packers, who have 283.3 yards a game they're allowing. And then Denver Broncos, Minnesota Vikings, the Chargers, Detroit Lions. Now, this is good. When you're talking about teams that you're looking possibly Super Bowl bound type of teams, Detroit Lions top 10 on offense, top 10 on defense, as is the Los Angeles Rams, Buffalo Bills. So those are 3 teams that are looking pretty good. Green Bay Packers they're allowing 283.3, but I don't know what's happened to them last couple of games. We'll see. Those are your top teams as far as total yards go. Now, looking at points per game right now, the Houston Texans are only giving up, 12.2 yard. Let me get this right. 12.2 points per game. Sorry about that. Which is a big lead over Denver Broncos, who are second with 16.8. Indianapolis Colts again. See, they're another team, high-powered offense so far this year and not giving up many points. They're giving up 17.8. Arizona Cardinals, surprisingly up here, only giving up 19.2 points per game, but having a difficult time winning games. Minnesota Vikings, 19.4. And then the Chargers and the 49ers round out the only teams under 20 points a game, 19.6 each for each of those. And then the Jacksonville Jaguars exactly giving up 20 points a game, right on the nose. Versus the Baltimore Ravens by 4 points per game worse than the 31st best team. The New York Jets are giving up 31.4. The Baltimore Ravens are giving up 35.4 points a game. And I know their defense has been just slacked with injuries. But honestly, let's say everybody came back. What would they get to? Could they drop 2 touchdowns off this and be giving up only 20 points a game or something, 21? That 35 is a huge amount. What a turnaround from one year to the next for them. All right, let's look at turnovers one more time on the defense here, on takeaways by the defense. Right now, Jacksonville Jaguars lead this by quite a bit with 14 turnovers. In fact, last week against the Kansas City Chiefs, they only had 1 turnover. That was the first game they didn't have at least 3. So 1 turnover there, which was a huge one, and that interception, but 14 for the Jaguars. Pittsburgh Steelers, 10 total turnovers so far that they've created. 10 takeaways, I should say 10 takeaways. 14 takeaways for the Jaguars, 10 for the Steelers. Then there's a couple, the Bears and the Lions with 9 apiece. At the bottom of this list, New York Jets have not had a takeaway in 5 games. Wow. No, not one. You think you just have a random ball bounce off of somebody's hand or running back just drop the ball. But so far, no takeaways by the New York Jets. You know that's got to change. It just can't continue like that. So when you're looking at the differential here, interesting that the Jets are -8. They're the worst. And the Jacksonville Jaguars are +8. They're the best. So 8 either way you go. Pittsburgh Steelers are +7. The Lions +6. So basically, it's almost evenly split here among teams that have a positive differential or a negative. The worst team, like I said, the Jets -8, and then the Raiders -6. So that's a look at some of the different numbers for these teams. And you can see why teams are in the lead. Jaguars, the Steelers, only 1 loss, even though they've only played 4 games. The Lions, 1 loss. Now the Chicago Bears are up here, a couple losses for them, but they're in the as far as this is turnover differential. Then you have the Colts, again, another team, 1 loss. And then interestingly, you have next the Saints. They're at the +5 in the turnover differential, and yet they obviously aren't playing that well. Play hard, but they just having a tough time winning. They have won a game finally. And then the Kansas City Chiefs +4, but they've lost 3 games so far. Eagles have lost their last 2. They're +2. And Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 1 loss for them. They're also +2. So a lot of the teams that are up there. Now looking at some of the worst teams here, the 49ers, 1 loss, but they are -3 in the turnover differential. They're one of the few teams that have a good record, but way down in the takeaway column. They're, in fact, the worst as far as a team that's good. All right, that's a wrap for that. Appreciate you listening. Next week, we'll be covering all the teams again, all the best players, the top 10s in various offensive categories, defensive categories. We're going to continue to take a look at the rookies. Who's the top 10? Who's the rookie of the year? Also, I'll start kind of gauging top 10 players, offensive players. Who's the offensive player of the year? Who's the MVP of the NFL after 6 games? We'll look at that, kind of look at some numbers. And so we'll do all that next week. Appreciate you listening. You can like and subscribe to this. You can see this podcast on YouTube. You can like and subscribe. YouTube at Just the Stats NFL. You can also find me on podcasting sites like Spotify, Apple, some of your podcast apps, most of them. And you can contact me at justthestatsnfl@gmail.com if you'd like. Appreciate you listening. And so until next time, I am out.